Usually we think of a camera as like a perfectly objective tool, you
Right.
know?
Yeah, like a mirror just reflecting reality.
Exactly. You just you point the lens, click the shutter, and the world is captured exactly as it was. It's this very one-way street.
Which is how most of us operate our smartphones every day.
Yeah, but what if the keyboard on your laptop could somehow like reach out and actually control the lens on your camera?
It sounds impossible, but it's actually a brilliant concept.
It is. So today we are doing a deep dive into an incredibly compelling excerpt by a photographer named Ang.
Yeah, it was published back in June of 2026.
Right, and it's part of a broader series called Notes on Photography. Specifically, we're looking at part 239, which is titled The Written Lens, Refining Vision Through Architectural Narrative.
Or, as Ang subtitles it, How Writing Sharpens the Photographer's Eye.
Yes, and our mission for this deep dive is to really explore this massive, almost, I don't know, paradoxical creative loop.
It really is a loop. It's fascinating.
Because Ang discovered that the secret to capturing a perfect photograph isn't just about, going out and taking more photos.
Which is the standard advice everyone gives you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Ang says it's actually about writing about those photos. Like translating visual art into the written word physically rewires how you see.
And ultimately, how you physically operate the camera itself.
Yeah, it's wild.
It fundamentally challenges the entire way we view the creative process. Because what's fascinating here is how Ang uses a highly specific, completely static architectural feature.
A skylight, right?
Yeah, a very minimalist skylight. Ang uses this one unmoving thing to teach us a universal lesson about perception and mindfulness.
Which is so cool.
We aren't just looking at architecture today, we are really breaking down the translation between the eye, the pen, and the lens.
Okay, so to understand how writing shapes vision, we kind of have to start with the environment that even, allows for this kind of deep reflection in the first place.
Right, the luxury of stillness.
Yeah, because Ang makes a rather aggressive claim right at the beginning of the text.
Oh, definitely. It catches you off guard.
It really does. Ang states that architectural photography is, quote, probably the easiest genre to master.
And even notes that you can do it pretty easily with just a smartphone.
Which, okay, let's unpack this. Because I have to admit, reading that, I found myself immediately pushing back.
I think a lot of photographers would push back on that word.
Right. Calling it the easiest just feels incredibly reductive to me. I mean,
Yeah.
Mastering the light, getting the perspective right, dealing with the sheer, massive scale of a building.
It's highly technical.
It is technically and artistically grueling.
Yeah.
So I initially thought maybe Ang just meant it was the most forgiving genre.
Forgiving in what sense?
Simply because a building doesn't run away from you. The luxury of time removes that physical pressure of capturing a fleeting moment.
Well, I actually disagree that it's reductive. I think Ang means exactly what is written there.
Wait, really? You think it's the easiest?
Well, you are looking at mastery through the lens of technical execution, right? Lighting, scale, finding the perfect angle.
Yeah, the hard stuff.
But Ang is looking at mastery through the lens of cognitive load.
Oh, interesting.
Because when you are photographing a moving subject, you are entirely held hostage by time.
Right, Ang contrasts architectural work with the experience of traveling.
Exactly.
Rushing through errands, snapping a quick street photo before the moment vanishes, and just, moving on to the next thing.
Yeah, when you are traveling or, say, shooting street photography, your brain is operating in pure survival mode.
You're just reacting.
Exactly. You're reacting to external stimuli. A bird takes flight, a taxi speeds by, and you rely on pure instinct just to capture the frame before it's gone.
You definitely don't have time to, sit and ponder the meaning of the taxi.
No, you don't have the mental bandwidth to philosophize about the geometry of the cab. But when you shoot a building, that friction of time is completely removed.
Building is just sitting there.
Right. The stillness of the subject doesn't make the art of lighting it any easier, to your point, but it grants you absolute control over the timeline. You aren't reacting anymore.
You are observing.
Exactly. You're deeply observing.
That distinction between reacting and observing is so crucial to this whole concept. When you aren't fighting the clock, you aren't just looking at a subject, you're actually sitting with it.
You have the luxury of stillness.
Yeah, the luxury of stillness.
And that luxury is the mandatory prerequisite for what comes next in Ang's process.
Because you need time to let your mind wander.
Precisely. Without that stillness, the mind never wanders far enough to begin forming a narrative. I mean, you can't write deeply about a subject you only engaged with for a fraction of a second in a blind panic.
Oh, that makes total sense. Which brings us to how Aang actually utilizes this luxury of time.
Right, the skylight observation.
Yeah. So Aang is staring up at this beautifully minimalist skylight and begins to really, dissect it.
The structural breakdown in the text is so precise.
It really is. The text describes this transparent glass, offering a bright but very subtle illumination. And in the center is an oculus.
Which is that raised circular opening.
Right, supported by a cylindrical ring framework. And to distribute the massive physical load of this whole structure, there are these slender ribs and cables radiating outward from the middle.
It's a very heavy piece of architecture.
It is. And reading it, it almost feels like looking at an X-ray of a building.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Like you see the hidden skeleton, the intricate bones all working together just to keep the roof from completely collapsing on everyone.
And what's fascinating here is how structural that initial observation really is.
Very literal.
Extremely literal. When given the luxury of time, Aang's first instinct is simply to decode the engineering of the space.
Just listing the parts.
Right. It is a literal inventory of physical facts. Glass, cylinder, ribs, cables.
But, and this is the turning point, those engineering facts don't stay literal for very long.
No, they don't.
Because Aang isn't just standing there looking at the ceiling for fun. Aang is tasked with writing a blog post about it for the Notes on Photography series.
The active translation begins.
Exactly. And when trying to articulate those radiating ribs to a reader, Aang makes this massive mental pivot.
The analogies.
Yes. The text notes that these slender structural cables closely resemble the ribs of an open umbrella, or the spokes of a bicycle wheel.
This is the exact moment the translation happens, and it is entirely forced by the medium of writing.
Because a photo wouldn't need that explanation.
Exactly. If Aang simply captured the photo and walked away, the visual processing would likely end at, well, that is a well-designed skylight.
The brain registers the geometry, says cool, and moves on.
Right. But the demand for written articulation creates cognitive friction.
I love that phrase, cognitive friction.
Because you cannot just hand your reader a dry architectural blueprint and expect them to feel the aesthetic weight of the space.
They'd be so bored.
They would. You have to find a bridge between the cold mechanics of the room and the human experience.
So the brain is basically forced to search its database for a metaphor.
Yes, exactly. The search for syntax, for descriptive resonance, pulls the photographer out of literal observation and into associative thinking.
The architectural cable literally becomes a bicycle spoke.
It transforms in the mind.
It is such a fascinating semantic shift. Because, think about it, a structural cable is entirely static.
Right, its only job is tension.
Yeah, its entire purpose is to just hold something in place and never ever move. But a spoke...
The spoke implies motion.
Exactly. A spoke is inherently dynamic. It is part of a mechanism designed specifically for propulsion and momentum.
It wants to spin.
Yes. So by simply choosing a different noun to describe the ceiling for a blog post, Aang completely altered the identity of the physical object.
And that alteration does not remain confined to the written page, which is, frankly, the core thesis of Aang's entire essay.
The literary analogy directly alters the physical act of taking the next photograph.
It bleeds back into the real world.
Yeah. Here's where it gets really interesting, because this is the part of the text I found just incredibly compelling.
The transition back to the camera.
Right. The transition from writing, pretty prose on a laptop to executing a technical strategy with a lens.
So how does Aang actually do that?
Well, Aang writes that looking past the glass and seeing a bicycle wheel completely changes the composition. Because the subject is no longer a static skylight. It's a wheel.
And what is the defining characteristic of a wheel?
It spins.
Right.
So Aang decides to introduce perceived movement to this entirely rigid structure.
Which is just a brilliant conceptual leap.
It really is. But I have to ask, as the expert here, how exactly does the act of typing a blog post lead a photographer to physically change a camera setting, like dialing down the shutter speed, to make a concrete ceiling look like it's spinning?
Well, it's a direct cause and effect. By writing about the spokes, Aang unlocked the concept of the wheel.
Okay.
Wheels spin. Therefore, to capture the true essence of the wheel, the camera must capture motion.
Even though the ceiling isn't moving.
Right. And consider the aesthetic philosophy behind that choice. Aang is dealing with concrete, glass, and steel.
Very heavy, very solid things.
Materials defined by their brutalism and unyielding rigidity.
Exactly. Any photography enthusiast knows the mechanics of a slow shutter speed.
Yeah.
You drag the shutter to let motion blur across the sensor.
Right, you use it for moving water.
Yeah, we use it all the time for waterfalls or like light trails from cars at night. But applying it to a concrete ceiling, that is an incredible conceptual leap.
It is entirely counterintuitive.
Aang is taking the most immovable materials on Earth and forcing them to behave like a fluid, kinetic object. The text mentions that the camera is intentionally spun during the exposure to simulate the rotation of a wheel,
It completely subverts the traditional purpose of architectural photography.
which is normally just to capture the building perfectly.
Right, the goal is usually to preserve the sharp, clean lines of the designer, to respect the architecture. But Aang is choosing to obliterate those lines in favor of kinetic energy.
That's so wild.
But think about the causality here. The vocabulary literally dictated the shutter speed.
The words spoke essentially reached out and turned the dial on the camera.
It proves that writing is not a passive ledger.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it isn't just a diary entry simply recording a past event. The act of writing is an active, generative tool.
It creates something new.
Yes. It found the blind spot in the photographer's visual processing and engineered a completely new creative approach. Aang wasn't photographing the architecture anymore.
Aang was photographing the metaphor
Exactly.
and injecting visual life into a still object.
Yeah.
The architecture itself obviously can't move, but the written lens breathes that movement into it.
It's a beautiful synthesis.
It really is. But what really anchors this text is that this spinning camera trick isn't just presented as like a happy accident.
No, it's not a one-off stroke of genius.
Right. Aang frames this as an isolated output of a highly repeatable process, like an actual methodology for mastering the craft.
The text outlines a very deliberate sequence for developing a photographer's eye.
Yeah, let's walk through that sequence.
It's simple but profound. You take the shot, you review it, you write about it, you learn from it, and then you go out to shoot some more.
Take, review, write, learn, shoot.
Yes. Aang refers to this as a beautiful cycle that just keeps repeating itself.
Which kind of flips how we normally learn things, right? Because
Mhm.
we usually think of mastering a skill as a very linear progression based on pure repetition.
The 10,000 hours rule.
Exactly. If you want to take better photos, you go take 10,000 photos, you practice framing, you practice lighting, and eventually you just climb the ladder of competence.
But Aang is suggesting that repetition alone is essentially a trap.
Right. To truly master the visual art, you have to temporarily abandon it.
Because if you only ever operate within a single medium, you will inevitably plateau.
You get stuck.
Yes, your visual instincts will only ever give you visual solutions. Aang's beautiful cycle breaks that plateau by demanding translation across mediums.
So you have to take the raw visual data, step off the ladder entirely, and force that data through a completely different neural pathway.
The linguistic pathway.
Yeah, you transition from the physical act of pressing a shutter to the intellectual act of critique, and finally to the linguistic act of drafting a narrative.
And the insights generated in that linguistic space.
Like uncovering the whole bicycle wheel metaphor.
Exactly. Those insights become the vital input for your very next physical attempt.
So what does this all mean for us? Because it creates this incredible feedback loop where the mediums are just constantly interrogating each other.
The writing exposes what the eye missed.
And then the new photograph challenges the writing to dig even deeper. The cycle feeds itself, but it upgrades its own software with every single revolution.
It's an engine for continuous improvement.
It really makes you wonder how universally applicable this is.
Oh, I think it goes far beyond photography.
Right. Even for listeners who have zero interest in cameras or architecture or any of this. The blueprint here, translating an action into text to uncover the hidden analogies within it, and then applying those analogies back to the action. It feels like a blueprint for mastering any skill.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it proves that knowledge and mastery are not linear. The friction of translation forces you to confront your own assumptions.
Because you can't just coast on autopilot.
Exactly. When you only do the action, you rely on muscle memory. But when you write about the action, you have to justify it. You have to articulate the why.
That is so powerful. We started today exploring the absolute necessity of stillness, how removing the pressure of time allows a photographer to transition from just reacting to a scene to truly observing it.
The luxury of time.
Yes. And we saw how sitting with a minimalist oculus forced a shift from rigid engineering terminology to a dynamic artistic analogy.
From cables to spokes.
Right. And we examined the profound implications of that shift. how finding the word spoke fundamentally rewired the photographer's approach, leading to that brilliant, totally counterintuitive choice of using motion blur on a concrete ceiling.
Blurring the brutalism.
Yeah. And finally, we looked at the beautiful cycle that makes this kind of revelation repeatable. Take, review, write, learn, shoot.
The engine of mastery.
Exactly. It is a powerful reminder that our tools do not exist in isolation, and sometimes the best way to improve your vision is to close your eyes and write. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It really is a remarkable framework. And as we wrap up today, I'd like to leave you with one final thought that kind of builds upon Ang's beautiful cycle.
Well, I'd love to hear it.
Well, we have spent this time seeing how writing about a static architectural photograph can unexpectedly inject perceived movement into the next picture you take.
Right.
So what happens when we apply this exact same translation process to our own static memories? We all hold these rigid, unmoving narratives about our past events we think we understand completely, stored away like a static photograph.
Like architectural history in our brains.
Exactly. If you were to sit down and write out one of those rigid memories, could the mere act of searching for the right analogy unexpectedly inject new life, movement, and perspective into how you view your own history?